business organizations in DuPage County. Marketing your business and connecting clients is their priority. Visit chambers630.com or call 630-968-4050 to join today.
See Michelle Malkin, Sean Hannity, and Laura Logan at Freedom Summit 2019. Tickets on sale now at freedomsummitchicago.com.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. I love this topic area, the development of media over the last 4 decades, really, as it's changed and the landscape has changed and continues to change with even much more rapidity than previously. And of course I do, because we're in media, so Exactly. It's somewhat interesting and somewhat important to stay abreast of what's happening professionally. But the intersection between how media and, most importantly, news media has changed and our politics and the nature, tenor, and tone of our politics. Provocative piece, and I mean that, interesting piece, in The Atlantic by Brian Rosenwald, who's a political and media historian. They just wanted to entertain, and he sort of tracks the rise of conservative talk radio, starting, of course, with The Godfather, Rush Limbaugh, in the late 80s into early 90s, and how it's developed and influenced and perhaps changed, he argues, the composition of the Republican Party over the intervening 3 decades. He's also the author of Talk Radio's America, How an Industry Took Over a Political Party That Took Over the United States. That was released just a couple of weeks ago. And we're pleased to have Brian Rosenwald on the show. Brian, thanks for being with us. Appreciate it.
Pleasure. Great to be with you.
So why don't you just lay out your case? You'll do a better job of it than I do. But essentially, from Rush Limbaugh forward, what happened, in your opinion, to the Republican Party with the rise of conservative talk radio?
Well, it's important to note as the bedrock that you and every other host out there, you go out there and try and do the best show you can possibly do every day. The industry is driven by business motives.
Right.
A lot of people on the left say, no, they're just like, there's a political cabal. There's like a morning meeting where they're handing out talking points, and it doesn't work that way. But what has happened is, as hosts and listeners have sort of had their own little clubhouse, and I mean that not derisively, but in sort of the way of like being a neighborhood bar in a conservative neighborhood, and they have a huge influence on the Republican electoral politics in primary elections. That and we've divided into more red states and blue states, and red districts and blue districts. So in a lot of places, the most important election is in a primary election. And talk radio hosts have this great bond with their audiences. In some cases, people spend more time with their favorite hosts than they do with their spouses. People who are out in a truck every day, or people who have a job where they've got Rush on for 3 hours, they might spend more hours with them than they do with their wives. And so what you have here is a situation in which Republicans who have the advantage of incumbency, especially moderate Republicans, but more recently pragmatic conservatives, have run into trouble because talk radio has the ability to go to their listeners and say, this candidate you might never heard of is good people. This candidate is is someone worth considering. And the advantages of incumbency can fade away as talk radio helps to boost the name recognition for that kind of primary challenger, and has helped that person with fundraising and energizing people. And the result has been that the Republican Party has moved significantly to the right. Republicans have to pay attention to what you're saying and what every show is saying nationally and in their own districts, because if they don't, there's risk in those primary elections.
Well, do you have to be extreme? I mean, could you be a moderate on talk radio and be successful?
You are one. The
Well,
answer is yes.
I think that there are some who have done it, but the vast majority tend to be far right. And it's obviously not everybody, but it's harder. There's some people who argue, and I disagree with this, that, moderates can't be passionate enough to do good radio, good television. That's why all the media that we see out there is pretty much hard right or hard left. But I don't think that that's true. I think the big issue is that many people in the business believe in what they call format purity. And the best way to explain this to your audience is that if you're listening to a country music station, you're not going to hear Beethoven. Mm-hmm. And a lot of radio executives have applied this to talk radio, which is to say that nobody wants to hear the moderate or the liberal on a conservative talk station and vice versa. So there's not a lot of exposure for the audience. As conservative media has proliferated, now as liberal media is starting to proliferate, you're not seeing as much cross-pollination. People are sort of living in an echo chamber. If you ever been in a place, I see it sometimes in the gym, where Fox News, MSNBC, CNN are all on at night, you're like, are these three different planets? Like, was this the same day?
Right.
They're not talking about the same things.
Right.
They're not even, it's not even the same news events for them that mattered that day. And as people are sort of dividing more and more like that, it's harder and harder for those dissenting voices to get heard, because when people do hear them, they say, well, we don't want to hear this. This is lies. Don't tell me that. And so there's a lot more resistance from the audience to it.
Well, right, but I mean, media creates community. It always has, right? When you lived in Joliet, you didn't live in Chicago, and then the 10 o'clock newscast came around, and if you live in Joliet, you live in Chicago, because we're all watching the same network affiliate newscast, so we're all talking about the same topics at the water cooler the next day. Well, that's just changed with the small d democratization of media in the digital age, and so maybe you have smaller communities, but it's still sort of the same dynamic of media creating communities of shared interests, and there's nothing wrong with that or dangerous around that. You can create a community of interest around, conservative policy solutions, and you can create one around socialist policy solutions.
I agree with you in theory that there's not a problem to having those communities. What I think is dangerous for small d democracy is that we live in a country that is basically 50-50. You can argue it's 51-49 or 52-48. And on some issues, there's more consensus. But we're in a country where right now, politically, both sides seem to think that the best way of getting elected, because they're worried about primaries primarily, is to say, we're going to come up with the most, we're going to give you policy solutions that you want, and then we're going to cram them down the throat of the other side. And that what happens is what you've seen with the Affordable Care Act. President Obama passes, this is his signature legislation to answer a campaign pledge in 2009, very early 2010. And now, a decade later, Republicans are still promising we're going to repeal it if we ever get the chance. And that's what happens when you shove something down the throats of the other side. I think you're going to see it with President Trump's tax bill with Democrats.
Right.
And so if people are not able to debate things, if they're not able to try to find consensus because they're living in fundamentally different worlds, then I think we have a real problem, because the country is still going to be 51-49. It's not like we have a 67-33 country or something like that.
Your focus was on radio, but you have to overlay the rise of cable during the same period where you had conservative talk radio rise as Rush Limbaugh grew, and then bore progeny. A good piece by Gary Abernethy in the Washington Post about Trump and cable news and its development. He talks about the first, CNN had just debuted in the early 80s, but it had fewer than 2 million homes. But then as that platform later flourished, so did the need for revenue. And then you had the political fight shows like Crossfire and other imitators. He writes, out of this divisive and salacious swamp climbed the combative, shocking, and polarizing Donald Trump, stepping onto a cultural stage constructed almost specifically for him. He suggests to pundits who are wondering why millions of Americans aren't shocked by Trump, that Trump is the progeny of their talents and efforts over the 30 years coinciding with the rise of cable news.
I agree with that. I say that he's sort of the child of talk radio, but I agree that you have to factor cable news in here. I talk a little bit in the book about Fox, and how Fox is basically taking the model that worked first on talk radio and applying it to cable television. There's obviously some differences because it's a more condensed format and there's visuals, but it's basically the same model that the talk radio pioneers, and there's a lot of intersection between the two. Of course, Sean Hannity is one of the leading talk radio hosts. He's been on Fox since day one. Roger Ailes, who was the mastermind behind Fox, produced Rush Limbaugh's television show. That Rush had a TV show from 92 to 96.
Right.
And then I found one archival tape that happened to have a live read, which is a commercial read by the host that Rush did in 1997, touting Fox News, telling people, give this new network a chance. We finally have a network that's not going to be objectionable to you. And the tagline was Fox News is fair news. Yeah. And that was, so there's a lot of intersection between the two. And, in many ways, I think this is what a lot of us missed in 2015. People said, well, Donald Trump's not going to do well in a Republican primary. He's not a conservative. Look at his history. He's been all over the place on issues. There's questions about how sincerely he believes even the most conservative things he's saying. But what we missed was that for decades, hosts and listeners have been sort of fighting and saying, hosts have been saying, these Republicans, they're not fighting for you. They keep promising you things, but look at what George W. Bush gave you. He's trying to cut deals on immigration. His spending has gone up. He added a prescription drug benefit to Medicare. We need someone who would just stand up to the left. The left is going to fight a blood sport, and our guys are just rolling over.
Right.
And Donald Trump comes along, and the one thing that, like him, hate him, in the middle, whatever you say about him, is he's a fighter. He is not going to take getting punched without punching you back. He is going to lash out, and he doesn't play by the rules. And talk radio has been all over political correctness for decades, and Donald Trump sort of embodies that ethos. He is, to a lot of people who are listening to talk radio, watching Fox News, it was like finally their favorite host was their candidate, and they loved it.
No, I think that's a fair analysis.
Yeah.
I do. I mean, the interesting thing though too is this is all in the context of sort of the overwhelming orthodoxy among the DC press corps generally, right? So I mean, you have Fox News and you have now the digital age conservative outlets, and you have talk radio, but they're up against the DC press corps that has a much bigger blowtorch that not only includes the Gang of 500, but all their outposts in major urban centers like ours here in Chicago, where there is sort of as I said, an orthodoxy of opinion. So I mean, I guess I'm a little bit questioning or uncertain about your view on, the distribution of responsibility for what you're describing.
Well, I mean, I think that the key to understanding this is, yes, the DC press corps has a huge impact on things. And yes, I don't think the DC press corps, even today, has totally figured out how to cover Donald Trump. When you have a president who doesn't play by any of the typical rules, I don't think they've totally figured out how do we cover him. But I think that what we have to understand is when you're talking about Republican primary voters, talk radio, cable news, Breitbart, things like that, Red State, Town Hall, they are reaching conservative primary voters, the people who nominated Donald Trump, to a much greater extent than the D.C. press corps is at this point. In fact, one thing that they did that helps elevate Donald Trump is that come the fall campaign, you're getting all these revelations about Donald Trump. You're getting revelations about his business career. You're getting revelations about how he's treating women, all these kinds of things. And then, I have a couple of quotes in the book where they go to interview people in the rallies and they're saying, well, I don't believe any of that. I don't believe he used the language that the press is saying he's using. Why? In part because people were skeptical of the press in 1988 when Rush goes national. There were a lot of conservatives who felt like they weren't served well. In fact, that creates the market for talk radio.
Yeah.
But you've also had hosts spending 3 decades running the mainstream media down. And some of them even came out and said, my God, look what we've kind of created, that people, they don't see the mainstream media as what it is, which is liberal, having a liberal cultural bias. The reporters live in kind of as you said, that inside the Beltway world, or live in big cities where they're surrounded by other liberal professionals who share their views, and that affects the stories they think are news, the questions they ask, and it left a lot of conservatives feeling marginalized. But because it's talk radio is an entertainment medium, you have hosts that have just been taking a blowtorch to them for 3 decades, and we got to the point where when Rush starts, people who are watching, we have data that shows that people who are listening to Rush are also watching the nightly news. They're also reading a major newspaper. Now they're stuck in this conservative world where when they even see something from the mainstream media, they say, that's not fact. That's a bunch of liberal Democrat cheerleaders trying to get Hillary elected. That's what they said in 2016. So it's a complicated picture, and you're right that the mainstream media, gave Donald Trump a lot of attention, and you're right that they play a big role, but at least with Republican primary voters and Republican voters, they have a lot less impact than their numbers would indicate.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, it's funny. We had Rich Lowry on the show a while back. We had him on a bunch of times, but a while back I asked him if he thought Buckley's firing line could be remade today, and I'm not talking about the Margaret Hoover version. I'm talking about how firing line was, and he was sort of skeptical. He said, I'm not sure it could. I'm not sure it would have a marketplace. I'm not sure that PBS would pick it up either. Because this would be such a great topic for a format like that with intellectuals on both sides really hashing it out. And I'm not sure there's any for something like this anymore. But I do appreciate your even-handed look at it. This is really interesting. Brian Rosenwald, political and media historian, author of the book Talk Radio's America: How an Industry Took Over a Political Party That Took Over the United States. And I'll tweet out his piece in the Atlantic as well. Brian, thanks so much for joining us. Good luck with the book.
My pleasure. Happy to do it anytime.
Take care.
Yeah, and he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Listen to podcasts of Dan and Amy from the AM 560 mobile app. Download it today at 560theanswer.com/mobile.
Message and data rates may apply. Individual results may vary. Exclusions apply.
But hey, I'm buying a huge flat screen TV so I can finally see it without my glasses.
Why not just get LASIK at the LASIK Vision Institute? That's what I'm doing.
My glasses and contacts are a pain. I'd love to finally get rid of these, but who can afford LASIK?
You can. Because the LASIK Vision Institute is offering dramatically low prices and an absolutely free consultation. Just text TRY